Ah, the Galactic Institute of Higher Learning, where species from across the cosmos gather to pretend they understand each other, while secretly wondering why evolution took such wildly different paths. Take Xenobiology 401, for instance, where our story begins on what would become an historically entertaining Tuesday morning. Zix Reth, or Zix to those who couldn't pronounce the subtle mandible click in their native tongue, sat nervously adjusting their sensory stalks. As an Arthidian, they resembled what you might get if you crossed a praying mantis with a chess master all calculation and caution, wrapped in an exoskeleton that changed colors based on emotional state. Right now, they were cycling through a fascinating shade of anxiety purple. The lecture hall itself was a marvel of accommodation engineering. Temperature-controlled hover pods for the methane breathers, gravity-adjusted platforms for the high-G species, and even a small aquarium section for the aquatic students. The pride of the university's all-sentience welcome initiative, though the brochure conspicuously failed to mention the incident with the photosynthetic students and the artificial sun malfunction last semester. The janitorial staff was still finding patches of accelerated plant growth in the oddest places. Professor NX Clax, a being who appeared to be mostly tentacles in a lab coat, though no one had ever worked up the courage to ask what percentage exactly, was preparing their teaching neural interface when it happened. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and in walked, or rather sauntered, the newest transfer student. "Sorry I'm late, Prof. Earth's rotation is about 3.4 minutes longer than your standard day, and my circadian rhythm's still doing the cha-cha with your time zone." Mackenzie Mack Rodriguez, Homo sapien, Deathworlder, and walking contradiction to every survival instinct in the room. They moved with the casual confidence of someone who evolved on a planet that actively tried to kill their species on a daily basis, and failed. Zix's color shifted to alarm chartreuse as Mack plopped down in the adjacent hover pod, which groaned in protest. Humans were denser than they looked, in more ways than one. "Hey there, buddy," Mack grinned, displaying those infamous omnivorous teeth. "Got a spare data stylus? Mine got crushed when I had to arm wrestle my door this morning. These high-G rooms are no joke." Before Zix could process this terrifying request for basic school supplies, Professor NX Clax cleared their throat equivalent, their tentacles rippling with what the class had learned to recognize as academic excitement. Never a good sign. "Class, before we begin today's scheduled lecture on non-carbon-based digestive systems, I have a special announcement. The faculty board has approved my request for a practical field study assignment, one that will give you all hands-on experience with one of the galaxy's most fascinating apex predators." Zix's exoskeleton shifted to dread mauve. Next to them, Mack was already rolling up their sleeves with an unsettling enthusiasm. It was going to be one of those days at the Galactic Institute of Higher Learning. Professor NX Clax's tentacles curled with dramatic flair as the holoprojector flickered to life, displaying an image that caused several students to activate their emergency respirators. Behold, the Nexophian shadow beast. The creature rotating in the hologram looked like what would happen if evolution had a nightmare after eating spicy food. 6 limbs ending in retractable bone blades, crystalline armor plates that could reflect energy weapons, and most terrifying of all 3 rows of teeth that produced their own bioluminescence. Because apparently the only thing scarier than being eaten is being eaten by something that lights up its own cutlery. Sweet mother of methane, squeaked T. Laurie, a gaseous student whose fear response caused them to temporarily solidify. "That's the apex predator that decimated the Kraxon mining colony." "Oh yeah, the incident of 3286, Mack chimed in, casually highlighting text on their datapad. "Didn't they find one of these guys had been using a mining laser as a back scratcher?" The class's collective horror shifted momentarily to confusion. Even Professor NX Clax's tentacles twitched in surprise. "Indeed, Mr. Rodriguez. The Shadow Beast's neural capacity allows it to understand and manipulate complex machinery. Combined with their adaptive camouflage, regenerative abilities, and strength sufficient to crush tungsten alloys." The professor paused for dramatic effect, though the dramatic effect was somewhat undermined by Mack's yawn. "They are classified as a Category 9 apex predator." Zix, now a fascinating shade of terror white, raised a trembling appendage. "Professor, isn't that just one category below humans?" "Correction," Mack said, finally looking up from their datapad with a grin that made several nearby students inch their hover pods away. "We got upgraded to Category 10 last month. Apparently someone finally told the classification board about Australian wildlife preserves." "Yes, well," Professor NX Clax continued, their tentacles now twisting in what might have been nervousness. We will be conducting a detailed behavioral study of a juvenile specimen at the Containment Sciences facility tomorrow. The class erupted in a cacophony of terrified protests, emergency evacuation requests, and at least 3 spontaneous molt cycles. Meanwhile, Mack was typing into their datapad, "Dear Mom, remember how you said college wouldn't be as exciting as that summer job at the Tiger Sanctuary?" Well, the Grand Library of the Galactic Institute was normally a place of hushed whispers and quiet contemplation. Today it sounded more like a panic support group. Holographic displays flickered across the study pods, each showing increasingly disturbing footage of shadow beast encounters. The library's AI had helpfully organized them by level of devastation and number of structural failures per minute. Even the AI seemed concerned, having changed its usual cheerful blue avatar to an anxious yellow. "Oh man, check this out," Mack's excitement cut through the worried murmurs. "This one's using a spacecraft's landing gear as a toothpick. Reminds me of that time I found a crock in my uncle's pool filter back in Perth." Zix, who had been maintaining a steady rhythm of color changes between worried lavender and terrified beige, finally spoke up. "Mack, I feel compelled to inform you that in the last standard cycle alone, shadow beasts have been responsible for the destruction of 3 research facilities, 2 military outposts, and 1 particularly unfortunate frozen dessert establishment." "The ice cream shop thing I get," Mack nodded sagely while munching on something they'd called a protein bar, an item that several students had scan-analyzed and determined was only technically food. Nobody likes brain freeze. Across the library, T-Laurie had condensed into their most dense state of anxiety while watching footage of a shadow beast using a quantum computer as a scratching post. "But Mack, these creatures can bend durasteel with their bare appendages." "Yeah, so can my great Aunt Martha after her morning coffee," Mack stretched, their joints making concerning popping sounds that sent nearby students ducking for cover. Though I'll give them credit for style points with that triple helix DNA structure. Very fancy. A new hologram popped up, showing a shadow beast demonstrating its famous adaptive camouflage by becoming nearly invisible, save for those haunting luminescent teeth. Several students immediately filed for transfer to less lethal courses, like advanced antimatter handling or experimental temporal physics. "Did you know," Mack continued, now doing casual push-ups while reading because apparently humans could multitask while exercising, adding to their terrifying capabilities, "that their teeth glow brighter based on their excitement level? It's like nature's mood ring." Zix's exoskeleton had settled into a new shade of concerning mauve they hadn't even known they could produce. "Mack, please." The last xenobiologist who tried to study a shadow beast up close ended up as a footnote in their own research paper. Literally. The beast used the researcher's datapad to add commentary. Neat. Their self-peer reviewing Mack jumped up, causing several hoverpods to scatter like startled birds. "Hey, anyone want to help me practice some wrestling moves before tomorrow? I've got this great technique I learned from a cassowary." The library promptly set a new record for fastest mass evacuation, leaving behind only Mack, an increasingly concerned Zix, and the library AI, which had now shifted to a distinctly worried shade of green. "Your concern is touching," Mack said to Zix, patting their chitinous shoulder with enough force to make their sensory stalks vibrate. "But trust me, after you've spent a summer as a tour guide in the outback, this is practically a petting zoo assignment." The library AI, processing this statement against its database of known facts about Australian wildlife, promptly crashed and rebooted in safe mode. Zix, realizing they were probably witnessing their last moments of sanity, decided to do what any rational being would do. They began updating their will, adding a specific clause about their collection of exotic minerals not being used as shadow beast toys. Just another study session at the Galactic Institute of Higher Learning. The Containment Sciences facility loomed before them like a monument to paranoia, all reinforced walls and energy barriers stacked on energy barriers. The security chief, a Volcarian named Commander Rax, whose metallic scales clicked nervously against his tactical armor, stood before the assembled class. "This facility," he announced, voice modulator pitched to maximum authority, "has 17 layers of security, quantum-locked containment fields, and enough firepower to vaporize a small moon." He paused dramatically. "We still barely consider it adequate." "Wow," Mack whispered to Zix, who had achieved a new personal record of cycling through 8 different anxiety colors in under a minute. "They really went all out on the baby-proofing, huh?" The security briefing continued with all the cheerfulness of a funeral dirge. "In the event of containment breach, you will hear this alarm, a sound that made several crystalline students develop stress fractures played briefly." Your emergency teleporters are pre-programmed to transport you to the nearest safe. Mack's hand shot up. Are we allowed to boop its snoot? The silence that followed was so profound that several psychically sensitive students reported hearing the universe itself facepalm. What Commander Rax's scales had shifted from professional silver to confused copper. Boop its snoot? Give it scritches? Maybe a belly rub if it's being good. Before the commander could process this unprecedented inquiry, the blast doors to the observation chamber opened with the kind of heavy hydraulic whine that suggested they could withstand a supernova. The class filed in, their hover pods clustering as far from the containment field as physically possible, while still technically being in the same room. And there it was. The juvenile shadow beast made every hologram and video look like a child's drawing. Its crystalline armor plates shifted colors like oil on water, each movement rippling with barely contained power. Those infamous bone blades extended and retracted in a hypnotic rhythm, and yes, all 3 rows of teeth were glowing with what could only be described as anticipatory enthusiasm. Beautiful, Mack exclaimed, pressing their face against the containment field like a kid at a candy store. Look at those secondary muscle groups. The biomechanical efficiency is off the charts. The creature turned its head, all 3 of them, and focused on Mack with predatory interest. Several students began quietly updating their wills on their datapads. Professor NX Clax's tentacles were writhing with a mixture of scientific excitement and survival instinct. Now, class, observe the specimen's adaptive response. Oh my gosh, it has toe beans, Mack interrupted, somehow even more excited. Under those death blades. Actual toe beans. The shadow beast, apparently confused by this unusual reaction to its presence, tilted its heads in perfect synchronization. Its teeth began glowing brighter, a display that had historically preceded several highly cited research papers about rapid structural disassembly. Commencing specimen release in 3, Commander Rax announced from behind what appeared to be military-grade blast shielding. Zix, whose exoskeleton had settled on a shade of absolute terror that physicists would later study for its unique light-absorbing properties, grabbed Mack's arm. It's not too late. Your teleporter still works. We can. 2. Are you kidding? Mack was doing warm-up stretches. This is way better than that time I had to redirect a stampeding herd of emus from the local mini-mart. 1. The shadow beast rose to its full height, a process that seemed to go on for significantly longer than anyone was comfortable with. Its armor plates shifted to attack mode configuration, bone blades extended to their maximum length, and those bioluminescent teeth reached a brightness level that would have made a supernova feel inadequate. A release protocol initiated. The containment field dropped with a sound like reality holding its breath. And Mack? Mack was already reaching for their pocket, pulling out what appeared to be a tennis ball? Who's a good boy, they cooed. Who wants to play fetch? The entire facility's AI system chose this moment to request early retirement. What happened next would be recorded in the annals of xenobiology history, though the official record would later be flagged for suspected hyperbole, despite 17 different species providing identical eyewitness accounts. The shadow beast, confronted with the tennis ball, briefly forgot it was an apex predator. All 3 heads tracked the fuzzy yellow sphere as Mack gave it a playful bounce. Then, demonstrating the hunting instincts that made it famous, it lunged forward with approximately 12 types of deadly intent. Fetch, Mack yelled, throwing the ball. Directly up. The beast's heads followed the ball. Mack used this distraction to dive under its guard, grab the nearest leg, one of 6, but who's counting, and execute what could only be described as an improvised suplex. You know what you get when you cross a shadow beast with a tennis ball, Mack called out, dodging a swipe from bone blades that could cut through battleship armor. Love 15. Professor NX Clax's tentacles were frantically taking notes while simultaneously trying to hide behind a datapad. Remarkable. The specimen is displaying previously undocumented agility in its tertiary muscle groups. Incoming. The beast, apparently deciding that if it couldn't catch the human, it would use the environment as a weapon, began systematically dismantling the observation room. Reinforced panels flew like confetti at a particularly violent parade. Did you hear about the shadow beast who went to the Dr. Mack rolled under a swinging tail, coming up in a perfect stance that made several combat-trained security officers take notes? He was suffering from 3 headaches. The creature paused, all 3 heads tilting in what might have been confusion or literary criticism. T. Laurie, who had been recording the event, suddenly solidified in shock. The human. There, teaching it wrestling moves. Indeed, Mack had somehow maneuvered into what looked suspiciously like a training hold, demonstrating proper grappling technique to a creature that typically used spaceships as chew toys. See, it's all in the hip rotation, they explained to the beast, which was now more bewildered than murderous. You've got great natural talent, but your form needs work. Let me show you. What followed was either the galaxy's most dangerous dance or the universe's most elaborate game of Twister. Mack weaved between slashing claws, using the beast's own momentum against it in a display that had several physics students questioning their understanding of mass and inertia. Notable observation: Professor NX Clacks dictated to their datapad, subject appears to be having fun. The beast, recovering from being flipped onto its backs, all of them, let out a roar that shattered several light fixtures and probably a few personal reality frameworks. Hey, why don't shadow beasts tell good jokes? Mack called out, sliding under a tail swipe. Because they have 3 heads but no punchline. The creature actually paused its attack, as if processing this assault on comedy. This gave Mack the opening they needed. Using a technique that would later be described in academic papers as absolutely bonkers, they executed a series of moves that seemed to defy several laws of physics and possibly common sense. It involved the tennis ball, a handstand, and what looked suspiciously like breakdancing. Observe Professor NX Clacks's voice hit notes previously thought impossible for their species. The human is utilizing rhythmic movement patterns to establish dominance. Zix, who had been maintaining a steady stream of prayer to various deities, watched in fascination as their color shifted from terror white to amazed gold. There, teaching it to dance. Indeed, the shadow beast, apex predator of the galaxy, terror of space lanes, destroyer of colonies, was learning the electric slide, sort of, with bone blades. That's it. You've got the rhythm, Mack encouraged, ducking under a swipe that could have bisected a tank. Now watch this next move, I call it the Melbourne Shuffle. The security team had long since given up on maintaining professional composure and were now running a betting pool on which dance move would be attempted next. In a finale that would be talked about for generations and spawn at least 3 religions, Mack executed what they later described as a little something I picked up from a cassowary. It involved a complicated series of feints, a backflip, and somehow ended with them sitting cross-legged on top of the middle head of the thoroughly confused beast. And that's why you always lead with your left feet. All of them, Mack concluded, patting the crystalline armor plates like they were giving a lesson at a petting zoo. The beast, in what xenobiologists would later classify as either surrender or an existential crisis, slowly lowered itself to the ground. Its bioluminescent teeth had dimmed to what could only be described as a respectful glow. Professor Mack called out, still perched atop their new friend. I think I'm ready to give my presentation on interspecies behavioral dynamics. Though I might need a few more tennis balls. The class, which had been alternating between taking notes and writing last wills and testaments, erupted in spontaneous applause. Several students had to be treated for shock, though whether from the display of human agility or the violation of known physical laws was unclear. Commander Rax emerged from behind his blast shield, scales shifting through colors that suggested his threat assessment software was having a meltdown. In 30 cycles of security work he managed, I'd never. That was, how did you? Oh, this Mack scratched behind one of the beast's sensory nodes, earning what sounded suspiciously like a purr. This is nothing. You should see what happens at an Australian kid's birthday party when the sugar kicks in. The facility's AI, which had been recording everything for posterity, decided to create a new classification category: humans warning yes. The medical bay of the containment sciences facility looked like it had been prepared for a war zone. Instead, they got Mack, sitting on an examination table, casually sharing photos on their datapad with the now docile shadow beast who had insisted on following them. And this is me with a saltwater crocodile. We called him Snippy. Had to relocate him from a golf course. He kept stealing the balls, thought they were eggs. The medical team, led by Dr. V. Raxi, a being composed primarily of scanning tentacles and confusion, was having an existential crisis. Their advanced diagnostic equipment kept insisting that their human patient was not only unharmed but had somehow achieved a lower heart rate than when they started. This is impossible, Dr. V. Raxi muttered, waving a molecular scanner for the 7th time. You don't even have elevated stress hormones, you have what appears to be endorphins. Oh yeah, best workout I've had since that impromptu parkour session with the kangaroos back home, Mack beamed. showing another photo to the beast, whose 3 heads were now crowded around the small screen with disturbing domesticity. Look, here's my mom's cassowary farm. Meanwhile, in the adjacent observation room, Professor NX Clax was having what could only be described as an academic meltdown. The implications are staggering. Their tentacles were typing on 3 datapads simultaneously. Not only did the humans successfully establish nonviolent contact, but they've also demonstrated previously unknown behavioral modification techniques through. They paused, checking their notes. Something called the power of friendship and sick dance moves. The other students, safely behind several layers of reinforced glass, were experiencing a collective paradigm shift. Tilari had solidified into a crystalline form that xenopsychologists would later classify as enlightened terror. Several others were quietly requesting transfers to Earth Studies courses, presumably to better understand what exactly they were dealing with. "Did you see?" whispered one student to another, when the beast tried to use its notorious disemboweling technique. And the human called it tickles. The other finished, their eye stalks still twisted in disbelief. Zix, whose exoskeleton had finally settled on a shade of profound realization blue, was composing what would later become a viral academic paper titled Deathworlders When Evolution Says Yes to Everything. "I think I understand now," they mused, watching Mack demonstrate proper belly-rubbing technique to the medical team, who were documenting everything with religious fervor. Humans don't survive despite their environment, they thrive because of it. Every challenge is just Tuesday. The shadow beast, now sprawled on its back receiving said belly rub, was emanating a subsonic purr that was causing minor seismic events in the facility's foundation. Its bioluminescent teeth had shifted to what the research team would classify as content pastel. "Remarkable adaptation period," Professor NX Clax noted, tentacles still frantically recording. "From apex predator to, what's the human term? Big softy. In under an hour." Commander Rax had given up on maintaining any semblance of security protocol and was now tentatively offering the beast a large rubber ball he'd apparently been keeping in his desk for stress relief. Should we update the containment protocols?" "Oh, absolutely," Mack chimed in, now braiding small ribbons into the beast's crystalline armor. No one dared ask where they got the ribbons. "I'd recommend more toys, maybe a scratching post rated for atomic durability, and definitely some dance pads. They've got great rhythm once you get them going." Dr. V. Raxi, still clutching their malfunctioning scanner, finally asked the question everyone had been thinking, but how did you know this would work?" Mack shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both casual dismissal and profound wisdom. "Look, when you grow up in a place where even the platypus defies explanation, you learn that everything's friend-shaped if you're brave enough. Besides," they added, pulling out another tennis ball. Their pockets seemed to operate on non-Euclidean geometry. "Everyone needs a good game of fetch now and then." The beast's enthusiastic response to the word fetch caused minor structural damage to the medical bay. Zix, watching their human friend teach an apex predator to play dead, all 3 heads taking turns, finally understood why humans were classified as Category 10. It wasn't because they were more dangerous than everything else. It was because they could make everything else look harmless. "Hey Zix," Mack called out. "Want to help me teach them some tricks for next week's talent show?" Several facility systems simultaneously initiated emergency backup procedures, just on principle. The next day's xenobiology class was standing room only. Word had spread faster than a quantum virus, and students from every department had crammed into the lecture hall, some even clinging to the ceiling with various evolutionary adaptations. Mack stood at the front, their presentation titled Galactic Wrestling 101 Making Friends Through Strategic Hugging displayed behind them. The shadow beast, now sporting a collar with sparkles engraved on it, one name for each head, sat beside them like an oversized, deadly puppy. "And that's why a proper suplex requires at least 4 limbs," Mack explained, pointing to their hello diagram. "Though if you have more, that's just bonus leverage. Any questions?" Every appendage in the room shot up. Yes, the floating cloud of consciousness in the back. But what if it tries to eat you?" the student pulsed anxiously. "Oh, that's just their way of saying hello. Like how Australians greet each other with G-Day mate while wrestling a box jellyfish." Professor NX Clax, who had spent the night reorganizing their entire understanding of xenobiology, cleared their throat equivalent. "Mr. Rodriguez, your unique approach has forced us to revise several fundamental theories about predator-prey relationships." "Thanks, Prof. Though to be fair, Sparkles here is really more of a big snuggle bug. Aren't you?" Max scratched under all 3 chins simultaneously, a feat that had the physics department furiously taking notes. Zex, now sporting a confident shade of wisdom sage, raised their hand. Perhaps we've been misunderstanding Deathworlders all along. They don't see a universe full of dangers. We see a universe full of potential dance partners, Mack finished cheerfully. Speaking of which, who's excited about next week's field trip to study the void leviathans of the Gamma Cluster? The collective gasp of horror was interrupted by Mack adding, I hear they're great at synchronized swimming. Several students immediately signed up for the trip, while others began taking bets on whether Mack would end up choreographing an underwater ballet with creatures known for swallowing solar systems. As the class wound down, Professor NX Clax made one final note in their research log. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about humans isn't their ability to survive anything, but their insistence on befriending it afterward. Mack was already planning their next presentation, tentatively titled Jazz Hands, the Universal Language of Peace, while Sparkles practiced their new trick of juggling antimatter containment spheres. The physics department had been surprisingly accommodating with supplies. And somewhere in the grand database of the Galactic Institute of Higher Learning, a new entry was added to the definition of human. This morning will attempt to pet anything. Success rate alarmingly high. Approach with caution and tennis balls. The universe, it seemed, would never be quite the same. Though it would definitely be better choreographed.